In the freezing waters above Russia, a new trade route is quietly emerging. A route that could shorten shipping between Europe and Asia by thousands of kilometers. And perhaps most importantly, a route NATO may never fully control. Not through the Suez Canal, not across the Pacific, and not through the shipping lanes the world has depended on for decades. Instead, giant nuclear-powered icebreakers are now cutting through Arctic ice, once considered impossible to cross. For centuries, global trade has been shaped by a few narrow choke points: the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, and the Panama Canal. Control those routes, and you influence global commerce. But as Arctic ice slowly retreats, Russia is opening something entirely different. A northern corridor stretching across the top of the world. A route filled with energy, military infrastructure, and strategic power. This is not just a story about ice and ships. It is a story about how the map of global trade may already be starting to change. Most people never think about the routes that keep the global economy alive. Every day, thousands of cargo ships move across the oceans carrying oil, electronics, food, machinery, and raw materials between continents. But despite how massive global trade looks on a map, much of it depends on just a few narrow passages. The Suez Canal in Egypt, the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, and the Panama Canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. These choke points are some of the most strategically important locations on Earth. A single disruption in one of them can send shockwaves across the global economy. In 2021, the container ship Ever Given became stuck in the Suez Canal for only 6 days. But during that short period, global trade losses were estimated at nearly $10 billion per day. Factories faced delays, energy shipments slowed down, supply chains across Europe and Asia were disrupted almost immediately. That incident exposed something many governments already understood. Modern trade is incredibly efficient, but also extremely fragile. And many of these trade routes operate in regions heavily influenced by Western naval power and financial systems. For countries like Russia and China, that creates a long-term strategic problem. Because in a world shaped by sanctions, military competition, and economic pressure, dependence can become vulnerability. And that is exactly why the Arctic matters. For most of modern history, the Arctic Ocean was seen as a frozen barrier. The ice was too thick, the temperatures were too extreme, and the risks were too high for large-scale commercial shipping. Even the world's most advanced cargo fleets avoided the region almost entirely. But over the last 2 decades, that reality has slowly started to change. As global temperatures rise, Arctic sea ice has been retreating for longer periods each year. Routes that were once blocked by permanent ice are now becoming navigable during parts of the summer and early autumn. And one route in particular has attracted enormous attention: Russia's Northern Sea Route. The corridor stretches along Russia's Arctic coastline, connecting the Pacific Ocean to Europe through the far north. On a map, the advantage becomes immediately obvious. A cargo ship traveling from East Asia to Northern Europe through the Suez Canal must pass through Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean before finally reaching Europe. But the Arctic route cuts directly across the top of the planet. In some cases, that can reduce shipping distances by nearly 40%. That means less fuel, shorter delivery times, and lower transportation costs. For global shipping companies, those savings could eventually become extremely valuable. But the Arctic is not simply a faster shortcut. It is also one of the most resource-rich regions on Earth. The Arctic is estimated to contain massive reserves of oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, and untapped energy resources beneath its frozen waters. And much of that territory sits close to Russia. That changes the importance of the region completely. Because whoever builds the infrastructure controlling Arctic trade may also influence the future flow of global energy and resources. And Russia understands that better than almost anyone else. For Russia, the Northern Sea Route is not just a shipping lane. It is part of a much larger long-term strategy. Over the past decade, Russia has invested billions of dollars into Arctic infrastructure. New ports have been expanded across the northern coastline. Energy terminals were built to support massive LNG exports. Military bases abandoned after the Cold War were reopened and modernized. But the most important piece of this entire system is Russia's icebreaker fleet. Unlike traditional cargo ships, icebreakers are specifically designed to crush through thick Arctic ice and keep shipping lanes open even in extreme conditions. And Russia operates the largest and most powerful icebreaker fleet in the world. Some of these vessels are powered by nuclear reactors. That gives them enormous endurance and enough power to break through ice several meters thick for months at a time. One of the most advanced examples is the Arktika-class icebreaker. These giant ships are not simply tools for navigation. They are floating infrastructure platforms designed to support an entirely new Arctic economy. As more cargo traffic moves north, Russia wants to control the ports, fuel systems, escort fleets, and energy hubs supporting that movement. In other words, Russia is not just opening a route, it is building a complete transportation and energy network across the Arctic. And that network serves multiple purposes at once: economic influence, energy exports, military logistics, and long-term geopolitical leverage. Because in the modern world, infrastructure is no longer just infrastructure. Pipelines become political tools, ports become strategic assets, and shipping corridors become instruments of power. The Arctic may look empty on a map, but for Russia, it could become one of the most valuable regions of the 21st century. For NATO and Western governments, the Arctic is becoming far more than a remote frozen region. It is slowly turning into a new strategic frontier. For decades, global maritime power was concentrated around warmer oceans and major choke points: the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. These were regions where Western naval influence was strongest, but the Arctic changes that geography completely. The Northern Sea Route runs almost entirely along Russia's northern coastline. That gives Moscow a major geographic advantage. Russian ports, military bases, radar systems, and icebreaker fleets are already positioned across much of the region. And unlike traditional shipping lanes, the Arctic remains extremely difficult to operate in. The environment itself becomes part of the challenge. Extreme cold, massive ice movement, long periods of darkness, limited rescue infrastructure, and enormous distances between operational zones. Even modern navies struggle in those conditions. That is why the Arctic is not simply about military strength. It is about who can survive and operate there consistently over time. And Russia has spent years preparing for exactly that environment. At the same time, NATO countries have started increasing their Arctic presence. Military exercises have expanded across Northern Europe. New Arctic defense strategies are being developed. And countries like Finland and Sweden joining NATO have increased attention on the region even further. But despite this growing focus, geography still matters. Russia controls the largest Arctic coastline on Earth, and infrastructure built over decades cannot be replicated quickly. That is what makes the Arctic so strategically important. The question is no longer whether the Arctic will matter in the future. The question is who will shape the systems controlling it first. Russia is not building the Arctic alone. Over the last several years, China has quietly become increasingly interested in the far north. Even though China is nowhere near the Arctic Circle, Beijing now describes itself as a near-Arctic state. That phrase may sound unusual at first, but for China, the logic is simple. The country depends heavily on global trade. Its factories rely on imported energy and raw materials, and much of that trade still moves through shipping routes vulnerable to geopolitical tension, especially the Strait of Malacca. For Chinese planners, the Arctic represents something extremely valuable: an alternative corridor. a route that could reduce dependence on traditional choke points and shorten shipping distances between Asia and Europe. That idea eventually became part of China's broader Belt and Road strategy. Beijing called it the Polar Silk Road. Chinese companies began investing in Arctic energy projects, LNG infrastructure, shipping research, and northern trade cooperation with Russia. As Western sanctions pushed Moscow closer toward Beijing, Arctic cooperation between the two countries expanded even further. Today, Chinese cargo ships are already testing northern shipping corridors during parts of the year. And although the Arctic route is still limited compared to traditional global shipping lanes, both Russia and China appear to be thinking long-term. Because the real value of the Arctic may not be about replacing the Suez Canal tomorrow. It may be about building an alternative system slowly enough that one day the world simply adapts around it. That is how major trade shifts often happen. Quietly, gradually, and then all at once. For centuries, global trade has followed the same basic geography. Warm water ports, crowded shipping lanes, and narrow maritime choke points connecting continents together. Entire empires were built around controlling those routes. But the Arctic may slowly be changing that system. Not overnight, not all at once, but gradually enough that the global economy may begin adapting around a new reality. As climate conditions shift and Arctic infrastructure expands, northern shipping routes could become more commercially viable each decade. That possibility is already influencing long-term planning inside governments, shipping companies, and energy markets around the world. Because modern power is no longer determined only by military strength. It is increasingly shaped by infrastructure. Who controls energy corridors? Who builds ports? Who dominates logistics? Who secures critical resources? And who creates the systems the rest of the world depends on? That is why the Arctic matters far beyond Russia. The region sits at the intersection of trade, energy, military strategy, and future economic competition. And in many ways, the Arctic represents something larger, the beginning of a world where traditional routes and power structures are no longer guaranteed. For decades, globalization concentrated trade into a few major corridors. But the future may become more fragmented, multiple routes, multiple systems, multiple centers of influence, and countries that prepare for that transition early may gain enormous strategic advantages in the decades ahead. The Arctic is still dangerous, still expensive, still unpredictable. But history has shown that once global trade discovers a faster and more profitable route, the world eventually follows. And that may already be happening in the far north. For most of human history, the world's greatest trade routes passed through warm oceans. The Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific. Civilizations rose around them. Empires fought over them, and global power was built on controlling them. But now, far above those traditional routes, a frozen alternative is beginning to emerge. An Arctic corridor, once blocked by permanent ice, is slowly opening to global commerce. And unlike many of the trade systems that shape the modern world, this one is being built under very different conditions. Extreme climate, remote geography, strategic competition, and growing geopolitical tension. For Russia, the Arctic is no longer a distant frontier. It is becoming a long-term economic and strategic project designed to reshape northern trade and secure influence in a changing world. For China, it offers another pathway connecting Asia to Europe. And for the rest of the world, it raises a larger question. What happens when the map of global trade begins to move north? The answer may take decades to fully unfold. But the infrastructure is already being built. The ports are expanding. The icebreakers are moving. And the Arctic is becoming more connected every year. Because the future of global power is not shaped only by armies or politics. Sometimes, it is shaped by routes. And in the frozen waters above Russia, a new route may already be changing the future of the world.